listed library building on Bancroft Road, dated from 1860, holds our extensive library collections. For anyone who's had the chance to visit, you would have been able to visit our reading room. Our reading room is now open again by appointment only, and we could share details of how you can do that in the current climate. So we are open again. So our library collections cover a vast range of popular subjects such as housing, health, immigration, includes thousands of photographs, press cuttings, as well as rare publications. Is stored on hundreds of linear meters of mobile shelving in our climate control strong room. We have over 20,000 books and pamphlets dating from the 17th century to the present day, electoral registers from 1901, trade directories from 1800, 25,000 photographs and illustrations, and you'll see some lovely ones today. Over 2,000 maps and plans dating from the 16th century. You'll see some of those today. Over 500 periodical titles, local census returns, and more. So today's session is looking at Black presence in Tower Hamlets. We are at 5:04 now. Genova and I will both be delivering different parts of the presentation. And then, so the presentation will last about 35-40 minutes. And then there'll be an opportunity to have a discussion and question and answers. And more often than not, Jenna and I love it when you all chip in, because we learn so much from everyone who's here. There's always someone who definitely knows lots more than us. So please do hold your questions and hang on to your comments, and we will pick this up at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jen to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Halima. Good evening, everyone. I'm Genova. Thank you for joining us for Black Presence in Tower Hamlets. As Halima said, we'll be both delivering the presentation together. Before I start, just be aware that because we're using contemporary records, there may be some language that we use that is very outdated and deemed offensive now. So yes, we'll try to use quoted commas when saying this offensive language, but just in case we don't. So sorry, people are still coming in. One moment, just before I start, just submitting the list. The people waiting. There we are. So to start, the history of London is often recorded in terms of waves of new arrivals and their impact on the city, particularly in East London, where the docks have a long history of welcoming immigrant populations from all over the world. When we talk about Black history in London, or indeed as Britain as a whole, there are two things which we tend to think about. Firstly, Britain's involvement in the slave trade during the 17th and 18th centuries in particular, and secondly, the arrival of the Empire Windrush in Tilbury during June 1948, which transported almost 500 migrants to Britain from the Caribbean and marked the beginning of the post-war immigration boom. But that's not the whole story. And so what I'd like to touch upon is some of the less well-known stories and experiences of Black people living in and around the borough from around the 16th century onwards. These are just some snapshots of stories in time, and by no means all of the stories of Black presence in Tower Hamlets. But I hope it gets you thinking and wanting to research alternative stories to the ones we think we know about Black people living in London. So here we have St Botolph's without Aldgate. This is an illustration of the build of the church in 1810, and the present building was completed in 1744 and was the work of George Dance the Elder, and was also built Mansion House, the official home of the London Mayor.
Sorry, Jen. The screen's not changed for me yet. And
oh, it hasn't changed. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry about that. Right, can you see it now?
I can. Can everyone else see it?
Everyone else see the screen now? Sorry, I just changed slides.
Yeah, that works.
Brilliant.
You. So here we have St Botolph's without Aldgate on the left-hand side. And this is an illustration from 1810. And this illustration shows the present church, but there has always been a church on this site for over 1,000 years. And the parish registers reveal that there were Black people living in the immediate area from as early as 1586. When we think of the Elizabethan area, we don't immediately imagine Black Africans being part of society. However, during the 16th century, the employment of people of African origin became increasingly common in England. Wealthy and not so wealthy people might have had 1 or 2 Black servants, footmen or musicians. Black people were certainly numerous enough for Elizabeth I to issue proclamations against them. For example, in 1596, she wrote to the Lord Mayors of major cities, noting that, in her words, there were of late diver Moors brought into this realm, of which kind of people there are already here to main. She ordered that those people should be sent forth of the land. However, it seems that her plan was unsuccessful, as many people still retained Black servants in the area. So why were there Black people present in Elizabethan London? Firstly, in the 16th century, there was a time of exploration and discovery, which led to the opening up of new trade routes and the resulting movement of small numbers of people. But more significantly, of course, was Britain's involvement in the slave trade. However, in the small parish of St. Baltos, without Aldgate in the 16th century, we find at least 25 people predominantly working as servants, not kept as slaves, as is often the idea when thinking of Black people at this time in London. From burial records from St. Baltos, we have burial records of people including Christopher Capevert from Cape Verde, a Black Moor who was buried on the 22nd of October 1586 and who was aged 28. We have Domingo, a Black Negro servant unto Sir William Winter, who was buried on the 27th of August 1587. We also have a Susanna Peevis, a Black Moor servant to John de Penayos, buried on the 8th of August 1593. We have a Simon Valencia, a Black Moor servant to a needlemaker. We have Casango, a Black Moor servant to Mr. Thomas Barber, and this also continues throughout the 17th century. We have an Isabel Peters, a Black Moor lodging in Blue Anchor Alley in 1616, and Anne Voos, a Black Moor wife to Anthony Voos, a trumpeter, on the 24th of April 1618. And this is also an image from one of the parish records of a John Cumquick, a Black Moor so named, a servant to Thomas Love, captain, on the 26th of November 1623. We also have many baptism records from the parish church that reveal many Black residents residing as servants had a desire to convert to Christianity once living in London. At the top, we have an image of a record of the baptism of a William Bristow, a Black son of Philip and Anne in Sweetland Court in 1705. And at the bottom, we have a baptism record of Elizabeth Dunbar, a Black woman aged about 25 years old, and she was born in Jamaica, but resided in number 86 Little Tower Hill. By the latter part of the 17th century, the British slave trade was fully established, and in the process, huge fortunes were being amassed by both traders and plantation owners. By the beginning of the 18th century, many wealthy and successful plantation owners began to return to London with their fortunes and frequently with their personal slaves. Large numbers of Black Londoners also arrived as a result of their involvement as sailors in the merchant navy, as well as soldiers in Britain's military. By 1783, it was estimated that there was anywhere between a population of 5,000 and 10,000 Black men and women living in the capital. However, this number was reduced significantly with the creation of the ill-conceived Sierra Leone settlement. Between 1786 and 1807, around 4,000 Black people were transported from London for resettlement to the colony of Sierra Leone with the help of the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And this reduced the familiarity of a Black presence in the city. Not far from St Botolph's at number 8 Aldgate Street were the headquarters of a relatively small publishing company called Archibald Bell, which dealt primarily in publishing religious texts. In 1773, he published the works of Phyllis Wheatley. She was born in West Africa, and Phyllis was sold into slavery at age 7 and transported to North America, where she was sold to the Wheatley family, who taught her how to read and write and encouraged her poetic talents. Her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, is believed to be the first book published by a Black woman in the English-speaking world. Despite her earlier fame, she died in poverty and obscurity at the age of 31 in Boston, Massachusetts. A year prior to her publication was the first ever slave narrative published in Britain by a James Albert, or previously known as Ukoso Gwinoso, an African prince born in Nigeria and sold into slavery at the age of 15. He was sold by a Dutch captain to a Calvin minister and his wife in New York, who taught him how to read and write And after their deaths, he enlisted in the British Army and eventually settled in London. And he married an English woman and resided in Petticoat Lane throughout the remainder of his life. And here we jump a little further ahead in time, as there was a decline in Black presence in Tower Hamlets after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, although there were Black servants and servicemen still residing in London at this time. Not too far from Aldgate, next to Whitechapel Station, we have the Whitechapel Mission. And the mission in 1876 began as the Working Lads Institute, which was based at number 285 Whitechapel Road, next to Whitechapel Station. The building still exists today and was then run by a Reverend Thomas Jackson, who had worked in the East End of London for over 56 years. He used this as the basis for his work in Whitechapel and the mission's many activities, including free breakfasts and penny dinners for local children, a medical mission, free legal advice, and a night shelter for homeless men, which also distributed food and grocery tickets to the poor. The institution was the first of its kind in London to admit Black people, and here you see some portraits from the Working Lads Institute. And also, during the First World War, the minister would take in Black servicemen from the Empire to give them some home comforts. You can see another image here in the middle of Reverend Thomas Jackson from 1915.
Thanks, Jen. I was engrossed there. So during the First World War, we have a relatively large Black population of seamen residing in the port and close to port areas, across the UK, but especially so in Limehouse and Cable Street in Stepney, when we're focusing on Tower Hamlets. In the image here, we have the Strangers' Home for Asiatics, Africans and South Sea Islanders, which opened in 1857. It's based on West India Dock Road. If you walk past it, it looks basically like a block of flats now, but Jen's just showing you where that is on the map here. So if you look closely, there's West India Dock Road just there, and it's as you're walking towards Canary Wharf, basically. So yeah, and it doesn't look like that anymore at all, but the site has been recognized as that. So this location, those residing there, became the focus of headlines during the race riots of the summer of 1919. These riots, arising between predominantly Black and Asian seafarers and white sailors, was created out of discontent by their presence in the area after the First World War demobilization. This saw white sailors attacking Black, Asian and Middle Eastern businesses in the portside areas across the UK. Increasing pressure eventually led to the government to legislate against the employment of what they termed as coloured aliens, quote unquote. This resulted in the Aliens Order of 1920 and the Special Restriction Order of 1925, where coloured seamen of African, Caribbean and Asian backgrounds who did not hold documentation to prove their status as British subjects were required to register at a police station as alien and therefore be subject to repatriation. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I was just admitting somebody. Yeah.
So following the First World War and during the Second World War and throughout the 1940s, there existed a growing Black population in Stepney, which is the name of one of the old London boroughs. So when we refer to Stepney in this case is the Metropolitan Borough of Stepney, before it became London Borough of Tower Hamlets when it joined Poplar and Bethnal Green in 1965. So in the archive collection, we have a copy of a report published in 1944 titled Report on Investigation into the Conditions of the Coloured Population in the Stepney Area. It was commissioned by a committee of concerned residents, chaired by Reverend St. John Grosser of St. George in the East Church, and it claimed that at the time, approximately 400 Black settlers lived in the Stepney area, predominantly male and working in the merchant navy or other occupations relating to the shipping industry. The report goes on to define exactly what is meant by the term Black at that time. It states that the total number of resident Black men consists of 45.4% of those that they termed colonials, 49.2% of Indians, and 5.4% were of other origin. They break the numbers down even further by stating 69.4% of colonials are of West African origin, and 17% are of Caribbean origin. The remaining 13.6% of colonials are from Ceylon, or what is today known as Sri Lanka, and Malaya, which loosely describes a set of states on the Malay Peninsula and Singapore, and also Aden, which is the port city in Yemen. Those of other origins included men from Sudan, South Africa, French West Africa, East Africa, and Egypt. This population was also supplemented by a transient population of seamen and Black US troops amounting to around 300, according to the report. It's a really interesting, useful report in highlighting, I guess, the diversity of Black presence, even within Tower Hamlets, even just within the Metropolitan Borough of Stepney at the time. So it shows us that despite the alienation of the race riots and further acts against African Caribbean population and Asian seamen, when the Second World War ended, many African and Caribbean seamen chose to remain in Stepney and seek employment instead of returning home where job opportunities were scarce. They were also joined by African and Caribbean stowaways who, like their predecessors, settled in and around Stepney, which at the time was a poor working class area near the docks. So here you see Black servicemen in RAF uniform just outside Colonial House, which is on Lehman Street in 1949. Lehman Street is, if you can see in the map, it's the red dotted line that Joan's just pointing out there. If you're unfamiliar with Tower Hamlets geography, it's sort of near Aldgate East Station, Lehman Street. So Lehman Street, just off of Cable Street. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So Lehman Street, just off of Cable Street. This is a couple of more pictures of Colonial House in later years in 1967 and 1980s. The Colonial Office, recognizing that it had held some responsibility for the welfare of people arriving from the colonies, opened a hostel and a social club at number 17 Lehman Street that provided recreational facilities for the predominantly Black African and Caribbean men, in addition to temporary accommodation for 13 men. Officially, it was a seamen's hostel, but in reality, the residents were often shore workers. So these pictures are showing that there was, I guess, support and services available for, support and services available for men well into the 60s and 70s. Is everyone able to see the change in slides?
Can everyone see the slide?
Yeah, I'm just checking the chat box as I go as well. Yeah, I think everyone's okay now. Thank you, Elaine.
I'll go to the next slide now.
Next slide, please. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. So if we look at that report published in 1944, we see Colonial House described as a small, unattractive place with a cold atmosphere. There was a small canteen in the basement providing meals during the day and a common room on the ground floor with a billiard table. Here you see a petition sent to the king by a group of predominantly Black men in 1949, which describes the accommodation as somewhere 10 men sleep here in bunks, which is worse than a ship. It is not a civilized way to live, in quote unquote. They are also described, they also describe how there is little entertainment, so they are forced to gamble or drink. The petition asks the king to make proper arrangements for the labor forces that have been asked to come, and signs the petition off as loyal subjects. If you could see closely, you could read more detail into that. The newspaper article on the other side of the screen, on the right-hand side, asserts that the government should make provision and it shouldn't fall upon the local authority. So it gives sort of the local authority's perspective on the matter. In fact, from other records, we know that Colonial House was raided by police on the 29th of January 1949. Card and dice games were in progress, and as a result, 2 people were charged with keeping a common gaming house, which a further 47 charged as frequenters. The petition ends with the men urging the king to request that the Colonial Office provide something better for them. So there's obviously provision being made, as I pointed out in the previous slide, but it was still not sufficient for what the men wanted or needed. And there was definitely perspectives on what these places were, and some of these perspectives of what these places were for, and what what sort of activities took place were definitely negative in the local area and in the local communities that were already there. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to be referencing the Edith Ramsey records consistently throughout this, and we'll talk a little bit about the records if you want more detail on it. This is the Edith Ramsey letter on the screen just now to Miss Richards of the Colonial Office. It's clear from the records that the Colonial House was not a particularly desirable place to stay. This is further illustrated by Abdul Mansara, a stowaway from Freetown, Sierra Leone, who came to Liverpool during 1944 when he was just 13 years old. So in the letter, he talks about his arrival in London. He was sent to Colonial House. Within the papers of Edith Ramsey, just to mention, she was a local community worker who served on the Colonial Office Advisory Committee and was particularly concerned with the issues faced by newly arrived immigrants in Stepney from 1940s onwards. So her records are really fascinating in providing an insight into what the African, Caribbean and South Asian seamen were experiencing at the time. She was also head of the Stepney Institute, which was an educational institute with a couple of buildings, the main one being on Myrtle Street, just behind the East London Mosque. Many African Caribbean people, men primarily, took classes there during the 90s, 50s and 60s, like tailoring classes and so on. We'll talk about her quite a bit throughout the rest of the presentation, and her collections of letters, notes and newspaper cuttings are held in our archive. We have recently actually redacted some of the materials. We read through a lot of the letters and there was a lot of sensitive information in it. So there are redacted copies available, but you're quite lucky that you get to see lots of detail in these ones here. So the letters are basically illustrating further and further the Colonial Office and the challenges that the men faced in being there and staying there. Back to Abdul Mansara, his letter dated in 1945, Edith Ramsey mentions him in 1945. He would have been just 14 years old, and she describes how without proper care, supervision and guidance, he failed to keep up with any of his jobs. He gambled, he frequented pubs and kept company with the wrong sort of women. The warden of Colonial House, who at the time was a man called Straker, lost patience with him and turned him out onto the street. He was eventually charged at juvenile court as a care and protection case and was committed to a remand home with the aim of repatriating him to Sierra Leone. So Edith Ramsey here is clearly appalled by the entire situation and frustrated by Colonial House, despite being established for the welfare of the people from the colonies. Appeared to carry out no constructive work on their behalf. In particular, she criticizes the appointment of the warden of the Colonial House, a middle-aged Caribbean man called Straker, who we know from additional records in the archives that there were several allegations against him. For example, he was thought to have links to communist agitators and was said to have urged Somali men to subscribe to a fund out of which he promised that they would be able to pay for their own representative in Parliament. He was also thought to have regularly sold clothing coupons to residents at a profit, in addition to running a nightclub in Dean Street as a sideline. So by 1949, Colonial House had become even more rundown and was closed by the Colonial Office. The reasons given for the closure were quoted in the Times as that social services were adequate and the men should be integrated with the local community and that money from the colonial welfare should be spent in the colonies. However, after repeated remonstrations for local African and Caribbean people, in addition to local campaigners such as Edith Ramsey, the hostel was eventually reopened by the London County Council in 1951. Next slide, please. I think it's back to you, Jen.
Oh, it's back to me. Thanks, Halima. Other than Colonial House, we had other local hostels used by Black seamen around this time. One was in number 5 Ensign Street, which is, if you can see the map here, where it says Welsh Street, that's now Ensign Street, and it's just off of Cable Street. And this was a tiny lodging house with just 6 beds, used mainly by Caribbean men by recommendation only. And here we have another image of the Empire Memorial Hospital at 747 Commercial Road, which is just on the corner of Salmon Lane. And the building is still there as it looks there in the image today. And it's now called the Mission, and it has private housing, and it's now private housing. So unless the men could find accommodation in one of these hostels, Black men were forced to find unofficial lodgings in the district, which were often even more undesirable and concerns to public health. We have this cut in here again, which talks about the Public Health Committee having serious concerns about where men from the colonies have been staying. So in the 1940s and 50s, in Cable Street, Lehman Street, Christian Street, these are all streets. If you can see, I'm going to use my cursor at the bottom. These are all streets around this area here. This is where a large number of African and Caribbean people settled. And in fact, local newspapers at the time referred to this area as London's Harlem. And sociologist Michael Banton referred to this area as the Coloured Quarter and published this book here in 1955, which also includes a brilliant map, I must say. Although there were some highly qualified and highly skilled African and Caribbean men, they were only able to secure unskilled or semi-skilled jobs, either being employed as labourers, porters at hotels or working in restaurants, or as stokers on steamships and on boats. So from the map, this map here from published within the book, it shows at the junction of Ensign Street. I'll go back down there again and use my cursor. And Cable Street, there is one cafe. There is a little map. There's a little map with icons in the corner that tells you what all of the little squares and triangles mean, if you can see it.
Can we just zoom in on the key a little bit, please?
You want me to zoom in some more?
Yes, please.
Right. I'm just trying to figure out how I do it whilst I'm sharing without stopping myself from sharing. Right. Oh, there we go. Can you see that?
Great, thank you.
Right, there we go. And they show that there is, that it's just this one at the bottom. I did this one here. And it shows that there is one CAF and 2 licensed lodging houses run by Africans in the vicinity, as well as a particularly well-known CAF at the time. It was called the Rio Club on Ensign Street. So let's see if I can zoom back out again. Oh, one moment.
Oh, sorry.
It's not easier to zoom in than zoom back out as I thought it was going to be. Oh, wait, there we go. Oh, it's done. There we are. So this is the Rio Club on Ensign Street. This image is from 1961. You can see the cafe on the right hand side. Reports stated that as well as this CAF, there was, at the time, 32 CAFs in the Stepney area that were frequented by black men, most of which would have been in the Cable Street area. And these CAFs were often described as being small, dirty places run by black, African or Caribbean men, nearly all ex-seamen, and they were assisted in the running of the cafes by white women. And many reports at the time describe that there was good food and usually warm rooms let out to men above the CAFs. And they also contain a wireless radio set, but also according to reports, the main function of these CAFs were as a meeting place for black men and white women. And essentially these reports were implying that the local cafes were places where prostitutes could be hired. So next one we have here is another CAF on the junction of Cable Street, known as the Blues CAF. So Edith Ramsey, her papers again highlight some of the issues relating to cafes in the local area and racial tensions over the course of the 1950s and 60s, when Cable Street became the focus of moral panic, as the issue of prostitution gained greater prominence in Parliament. There was prostitution historically in the area long before there was a large black community. For example, a home for penitent prostitutes was established in the 18th century. But in the 1950s and 60s, the area became notorious for it, portrayed in the national press as London's red light district, in the same way that Soho was later described. One person who was particularly celebrated for his campaigns to end prostitution in the Cable Street area during the 1950s and 60s was Father Joe Williamson. Father Joe was a crusading East End clergyman, the vicar of St. Paul's in Dock Street, which was just next to Ensign Street. He was also a chaplain to many of the cafes in the area, and he also visited the hostels that the men resided in. He also introduced a Good Friday walk of witness through the streets, especially through Cable Street, through the Cable Street area. Although Father Joe was much loved by many, he proved to be a source of irritation to others. There is an argument that he stigmatized the entire area and the people that lived there. And when reading through some of his personal papers, it seems that sometimes there is a moralizing undertone in his words, in contrast to Edith Ramsey, who gained the nickname the Florence Nightingale of the brothels, and was determined to prevent unsympathetic observers turning the issues in the area into issues of race, and would rather they focused instead of the dilemma of the young women drawn into prostitution in the area. So these are some photographs from Father Joe Williamson's archive collection, which include black women and some mixed race children. And so far we've talked much more about men. Halima did touch upon the 1944 report, and the report also commented on how many mixed race children there were in the Stepney area. And from the report, there were 136 black or mixed race children in the local area, 61 having Indian fathers and 71 having colonial or black fathers, and 44 having fathers of other origins. We do have some testimonies of black women living in the area as well. For example, within Edith Ramsey's papers, Here we have a letter dating from 1946 from a Mrs. Lindo, from a Mrs. Lindo who came to London in June 1938 from Jamaica, and her husband Cecil was in the Merchant Navy. In his absence, the entire work of the household and care of the 2 children fell upon her, and she fell into ill health. And according to Edith Ramsey's letter to the Colonial Office, Mrs. Lindo sought to return to Jamaica but did not have the funds to do so. And she's described as being very homesick, like many others, and had suffered from severe health problems due to wartime difficulties, air raids, and adjusting to a new life in a new country. Ramsey fears that unless she is allowed to return to Jamaica, her health will deteriorate and her children will be forced into care. The letter also highlights racial prejudices at the time. As it says in the letter, it is difficult for anyone to obtain paid help in the house, and Mrs. Lindo has found that it's difficult, that the fact that she is a coloured woman adds to this difficulty. Mrs. Lindo eventually secured a place on a ship bound for Jamaica in March 1946. Here we have an image of Kathleen Sama. She was one of Black female activist in the Stepney area, and she was born in Ethiopia and was a British organiser. And as a child, she moved to England and became a founding member of the Stepney Coloured People's Association, an organisation working to improve the community relations, education and housing for Black people. And she also owned a home in the North East Passage at number 5, and this is just off of Cable Street as well. And this is a report from Edith Ramsey's papers in 1949 with the house that she run with her husband Solomon. And it talks about her experiences running this lodging house that was used mainly by Somali men. And documenting the experience of them running the lodging house, it talks about how she attempts to keep the men on the straight and narrow, keeping them away from drink and women, and blaming lack of recreational facilities for Black men in the area as the cause for them turning to drink and gambling and such. It also comments that she has 2 children in the home and she cannot hire help as respectable women will not work for Blacks. So she does it all alone whilst her husband is at work, whilst also expecting a 3rd child. So despite Ramsey's and other efforts, the area was targeted for slum clearance in the early 1960s. This was either initiated by local authorities like the Stepney Borough Council or by the London County Council. Sometimes people were rehoused locally in new estates. Otherwise, there was a tendency for people to migrate eastwards towards Essex to new London County Council estates being built or private housing. Generally, at this time, slum clearance schemes were welcomed by local residents. And in Stepney, this clearance resulted in the displacement of much of the local population, including the African and Caribbean immigrants who reside in there. Although there was a continued growth of Afro-Caribbean and Asian presence via seafarers in the 1950s and 60s, the dramatic increase in Bengali immigration to the area in the 1960s and especially the 1970s meant that the remaining Black population was demographically overshadowed, and the brief life of a small community of people of African origin essentially came to an end. And that's it for me. I hope that wasn't too much information to retain in a short space of time.
Thank you, Jen. So before we jump into our conversation, thank you for everyone who's sort of introduced yourselves. So you can present your questions in 2 ways. You can sort of raise your hand and let us know that you want to say something, and then Jen can unmute you and you can present your question, or you could just pop it into the chat box if you like. If you want anything clarified, if you have any questions around some of the materials we've shown you, if you have any research inquiries that you're working on in relation to this topic. Oh, thank you, Elaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really interesting researching it and going through the research and some of these papers. It was all learning for me too, and Halima as well.
Yep,
So
definitely.
things that we didn't know, so many things we didn't know. I've lived here forever and I didn't know most of the 80% of these things. So it was great learning for myself.
So Ruth is asking, how can we ensure women like Edith and Kathleen are celebrated and recognized by more people in Tower Hamlets?
This is very true.
Very good question. In fact, just off the top of my head, someone has actually gotten in touch with me via East End Homes, and they are trying to do a plaque for Kathleen Sama, actually.
Is it where she had her lodging house?
I think so. I have to refer to my emails. It's apologies, everyone. It's just a live thing that's going on email at the moment. So we are supporting, hopefully, with the research archive side of things. They are hopefully looking into the site and planning for that. Because it's Tower Hamlets and because it's such an incredibly historically rich borough, we have a long list of people that various residents have put forward to be commemorated on blue plaques as it is. So it does take quite a long advocacy campaign to make it happen. But this lady who has gotten in touch with me seems to have the ears of lots of interesting, important people. So she's trying to get her ducks in a row on that. I will try and work out where the exact location is. So if it does come into being, hopefully we will advertise it via a newsletter.
Yeah, I think they need to do. I think they need to come to what they were saying that I did see the email in the inbox, and it was saying that they do need to just do some more research on exactly where the lodging or where she was based to see where the plaque would. I'll put a case together as to where the plaque would be.
So yeah, no, they that's true. They needed a bit more research. I think more interpretive research. They've identified a place. That's why Eastern Homes is being involved, because it's now housing. Most of the sites we've mentioned today, as you've all noticed, are flats. So that's why the housing association is involved. So Elaine Swan's just mentioned the East End Women's Museum article on Dr. Bernardo's East End, girls at Dr. Bernardo's East End Homes. I actually haven't seen it. Genova and I were actually just talking about Caroline Bress's article on Black children in Dr. Bernardo's, but this might be slightly different. Thank you so much.
Thank you for forwarding that. We've got another one about, do you know which cemeteries early Black residents of Tower Hamlets tended to be buried in? Good question. Cemeteries are always a tricky one.
Well, there'll be churchyards and burial.
Yeah.
Near churches, some of which you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, didn't you, Jen?
Yeah. But the cemeteries themselves, because some of them are from the 16th century, I'm not really sure about where the cemeteries would now be, because it's so long ago. We have like the parish registers and burial records, some of them, but I'm not really sure about the cemeteries.
Just to add to that, having worked in a cemetery records and burial records are often held by the cemetery itself and by the cemetery managers. Our historic cemetery is Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park now. That's our main historic cemetery. The tricky thing is, how do you research burials that are burials of people who are of Black heritage? It's whether you see it in the name or not, basically. So all the names that Jen and I have mentioned today, for example, you may not necessarily, you can walk past someone who might be of African Caribbean descent, but you might not be able to tell that they are.
If you can still see it from the 16th century on the headstone, if you can still make it out, because they only mention it in the burial record in the register because it says Black servant, but on the actual headstone, if you could read them now, I doubt it, unless somebody has, because sometimes people go to cemeteries at some point and note down everything that's on the headstone if somebody did do that, but sometimes it's very rare.
Yeah, sometimes they do, but as Jen mentioned, if it's faded away, it's tricky. If the family has moved away, if there's no family, it's quite tricky as well. It's mostly families very who are visiting the people who are buried, who can tell you.
And if they had a headstone.
Yes, exactly. So it's all sorts of trickiness with
Yes.
burial records, guys.
Yes, indeed.
Which is why we are glad we don't hold that many burial records.
So someone's saying about redacted original documents that are redacted. So we've redacted personal information after a certain date. So if it's in the last 84 years, then we'll take out addresses, we'll take out people's personal information that could lead back to people that are still alive. So it doesn't take away the content of the collections. It just takes away personal information. So usually we block out certain things, and you can still see majority of the wording. It's just personal information that's taken out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We have someone from the Mixed Museum here saying, thank you, very interesting talk. At my organization, the Mixed Museum, we work and share to preserve the history of racial mixing in Britain. Michael Banton's work is very useful in shining a spotlight on experiences and attitudes to mixed race couples. But just to get to the point, I really enjoyed seeing the photo of the mixed race family on the doorstep. One day, if you had any other oral histories or any other photographs of such families from early mid 20th century in your archives. Very good question, actually.
The oral histories, Where I Belong, that's including women of African and Caribbean?
Yes, Where I Belong focuses on women of African Caribbean heritage.
Yeah.
I know, for example, Judith St. John is one of the oral histories on there. She's a colleague of ours at London Borough of Tower Hamlets, for example. I think she's of mixed heritage as well. So yeah, I don't know. We don't know off the top of our heads, but Jen is right. You can look at the Where I Belong oral history collection. If you go to our catalogue and type in Where I Belong, you'll bring up all of the oral histories under that.
Or you can just search in the archive, and under oral histories you'll find it there. We've got a whole collection of oral histories there.
I also know that if you're looking at mixed race children from other communities, I know that there's a record of Chinese and Irish, English sort of mixed race children in our collections. So we will actually have a whole bunch of research guides being published on our website very soon, which is very exciting. One of them will be researching Chinese heritage or Chinese settlement in Tower Hamlets. And that's fascinating, but focus slightly different geography in Pennyfields in Limehouse rather than Stepney. So yeah, it's different ways in, and the various guides that are going to be published will hopefully aid you in your research.
There will be a migration guide going up in the next week or so on our website that will have links to all of the different community groups and how to research them. Yeah. There's another question here about about food. And I'm sure you can answer this better than I can, Halima.
Research food history in Tower Hamlets and wondered if you'd come across anything to do with Black women and men and food. Do we know what was served at the time at some of the cafes or lodgings? Weren't Lumbi Arts doing something about Rio Cafe? So you're right. For anyone who doesn't know Lumbi Arts, they're a fantastic Somali arts organization based in East London. They've been doing amazing work in raising money to put forward seed money to create the first Somali museum in the UK. They've actually done fantastic events on Kathleen Sama as well, film screenings and so on. They were researching Rio Cafe as a site, hoping to look at that site for the new Somali museum in the UK. As for the actual food recipes, I actually wouldn't know. I know that food was definitely served. There's more around food and later on sort of the Bengali migration, but unfortunately food and earlier migrations is patchier. Again, Chinese migration and food is explored heavily. For whatever reason, in popular imagination, food is associated with certain communities, and it generates more research and inquiry, and the others less so. So your guess is as good as mine, Elaine.
There is some mention in Edith Ramsey's papers about the food being good, about good food being served. I don't know if she elaborates on the good food and specifying what makes it good, but she does mention that it is good food being served. So, and because it's a mixture as well. It's a mixture. It's African, it's Caribbean, and some of them were owned by, some of the cafes were owned by Maltese people as well. So it's a complete mixture of different types of food, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, we have the map of where the cafes used to be.
Yeah,
that's about it. And then maybe Elaine, you could scour through the Edith Ramsey papers and see if there's anything.
Maybe that would maybe a good project.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your thanks and for your comments on the presentation.
Negative. I think because as someone did say about, I did appreciate the presentation, but felt the overall tone was slightly negative and veered more towards stereotypical narratives. Of course, we have researched the collections that we have, so everything that we've shown you is taken directly from the collections and personal papers of people that were commenting at that time. So those, obviously you have to just think about when they were writing and when they were commenting, the kind of people that were commenting and who they were commenting on as immigrants and basically aliens, as they like to refer to them. So that's probably why it seems that they are stereotypical narratives, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, as historians, I guess we use the collections as a way of looking into these experiences. The reason why we talk about Edith Ramsey a lot here is because a lot of her collections, she's tried to she's tried to write as close to someone's experience as possible. A lot of her letters are written almost translating what someone has said to her directly rather than paraphrasing it. So that's why we used her quite heavily. But by no means, as Jen mentioned, we don't see it as sort of the only perspective. It's one perspective. If we had lots of first-hand testimonies from Mansara and the stowaways and the many names we mentioned, we would have preferred to use that if we had that available.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't.
Oh, let's go down there.
Is there a list of digital items? Oh, sorry, before that, what relationship did the Black communities have with the Jewish community, and how were they seen by the British Union, fascists and other racist groups at the time who were involved in the Battle of Cable Street? That's a really good question.
Yeah. Because obviously Cable Street, the Battle of Cable Street, there would have been lots of Afro-Caribbean people living there during that time. We do have a lot about the Battle of Cable Street in our collections. We do have an online exhibition
on the Battle of Cable Street.
No, but we do have a lot of art stuff on our website about the collections relating to the Battle of Cable Street.
We will have one of the new guides will be about political sort of organizations and protests actually as well.
Yeah.
But the question specifically asking about sort of relationship between Black communities and Jewish community, and I actually don't know at all.
Yeah. Well, we do have that image. That's that image that we have of the Black tailor working in a Jewish tailoring shop in Whitechapel.
Yes.
So
that's an interesting one.
That's a very, very, very
well remembered
photograph. Yeah. So we have that. So I'm sure that many Black men at the time did try to obtain jobs in predominantly Jewish areas at the time, because we do have proof of that. Even if it's just one photograph, it's still something. And the Battle of Cable Street as well. I'm sure that, if I remember rightly, that the fascists were drawn to that area because of the large black population there, or maybe I could be wrong off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, definitely because of the large mixed population. And I guess the response, people are saying it was sort of predominantly Jewish organized, but I think it's also partly to do with which communities have arrived and had the chance to settle and organize politically. You know, whatever decade you're looking in, you'll have arrivals, migration, groups that have just migrated and arrived, other groups that have settled and are feeling more confident and comfortable, and then other groups who have organized themselves very well and quite politically sophisticated. So you see that happening in different eras throughout the history of the East End. So if you're looking at the 70s, the Bangladeshi community is very politically active, but maybe less so earlier on. So I think maybe that's why there might not be as many other communities reflected in how the Battle of Cable Street was organized. Is there a list of digital items?
So not from this particular collection. We do have a lot of archival items digitized, but not from the Edith Ramsey collection.
So
you can. Sorry.
There is something. There's one online resource. Hang on, I had it up just a second ago. It's called Our Migration Stories, and it just has like one or two of the papers. Hang on, I had it up just a second ago. That's it. If you search seafarers and stowaways on Google, you'll see a project that we did briefly with the LSE, my predecessor and the previous archive manager. They wrote a small piece.
Migration Stories, the one just before the Olympics, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's not all of the Edith Ramsey papers, but it's just one or two examples, and it's basically before our policies kicked in around redaction and copyright. So it might go soon, but for now it's there, and have a look. Oh wow, loads of comments and questions.
Thanks everybody.
The new book, Woman in White Coat by Abby Waterman, gives an interesting view of growing up in the area and people from various parts of the world who lived in the neighborhood. Thank you very much, Ruth. We will look into that. In fact, we may need a copy of that for our collection. Thank you very much.
Yeah, our librarian loves ordering new books.
And we love him for it.
Yes.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, I think we're wrapping up. Just to say, we do have a quick evaluation form, and we'd really appreciate your feedback, especially for those who have joined us right from the beginning. You've seen we've changed up our formats a little bit, taken different focuses on different topics, and also we're always open to suggestions around what parts of the collections you'd like to see. It's always a helpful way for us to structure our programming. So Jen's just going to pop the evaluation form into the chat box. It'll take just literally a few minutes, a minute or two. So we appreciate your feedback. But if that's everything from everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And we will leave you to your dinner. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one. We haven't got events up yet for November and December, but if you just keep an eye on our newsletter and our usual social media channels, that will be published soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Halima.
Thanks, Genova.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us again. Oh,